Hello, I'm Toycat, and China has said that it is ready for any type of war with the United States. Thankfully, this is the only concerning rhetoric that has come from the US recently, and so when you hear that China has increased its defense spending by 7.2% this year, are you meant to feel good about that? Is it a good sign that all countries are spending way more on weapons of war, or is that a bad sign? I figured I would try and tell you about the nuanced take on it today, as we start by mentioning that the quote of China being ready for war is in basically every headline, and it is technically a quote, but the full quote is that in response to tariffs, they said if war is what the US wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end. Still pretty concerning that they would take some tariffs and say, we'll start a trade war. In fact, screw the trade war, let's go for a regular war, but you can see that with the full context, they're effectively saying, yeah, we would fight a regular war if it came to it, but ultimately it's a trade war that we're going for right now, responding to the fact that the United States has said that it is all down to China in importing the drug fentanyl, and then they're saying no, that's a really flimsy excuse to raise UF tariffs on Chinese imports, and intimidation does not scare us, bullying does not work on us, pressuring, coercion, and threats are not the right way of dealing with China. And indeed, the US-China relationship is always one of the most contentious in the world, but it seemingly is getting substantially worse. And so what's interesting about this is that China does have the second largest military budget, but it's far smaller than the US, and also far smaller as a percent of GDP at just 1.6. And so this is something that we're gonna have to come back to. It's very essential, but let's compare this to the other military spending issue in the world, because the US has been asking for a very long time, and you could argue they've recently forced their hands, of the US has been asking for Europe to spend a lot more on their military, and so the UK and EU are both planning to rearm right now, because the US is appearing to be an unstable partner, but you could argue, I hate to argue this point, because I hate when people look at something really crazy dumb happening and go, look, it's really genius if you just think about this, but I do think on at least this decision, the US has been trying to get Europe to spend more on defense, and one of the easiest ways to pull that off is to deliberately force the hands of an issue where Europe wants something and the US does not want something, let's say. And so that is, indeed, this is something that Germany's new chancellor, or Germany's new head of government soon, has actually said, because it's still forming a government, but basically he suggests that, yeah, the US president's rage was pre-planned and is deliberate as a way to get European countries, all of whom agree that Ukraine should not just be allowed to be invaded by its neighbor, to actively step up and work on their defense itself. Because any, if you think about it this way, I guess, any spending that the United States does on defense, or rather lacks in defense in Europe, is going to be made up by Europeans, and indeed we'll fill that hole. Again, you could see from the coalition of the willing, or the peace in Europe people, basically, there's a big summit where basically every other NATO leader, every other EU leader came together and said, yeah, actually, wouldn't it be great if we could go ahead and have a world where Ukraine can't be invaded by its neighbor? Actually setting up a global system of setting up a system of peace where we say to each other, you shouldn't invade each other, is a good thing. But any defense spending that the US doesn't spend on this, despite ramping up their spending, is spending they can spend in other places where maybe, again, to put it this way, if you don't spend in Europe, Europe might spend and get similar goals to you. It's not quite going to be the same, but it's at least similar. But if you spend in the Asia Pacific region, let's say you've got a big mounting threat that you believe is your biggest threat and you're starting trade wars with them, then any defense spending that you can reallocate over there is probably going to be more to your benefit. Indeed, if you put it this way, if you stop arming Taiwan, Taiwan probably can't continue to arm itself. If you stop arming Ukraine, then you can hope that there's enough other countries in Europe that feel the threat of a insurgent Russia and say, ooh, maybe we should step in and do that. Is that actually the move? Again, I think you can only analyze this so much, but I think the bigger question that I wanted to answer with this video is kind of coming down to the idea of why is the US going in such a different direction with its plans, really? And also, is it a good thing that every other country, including direct adversaries of the United States, you could say, is it a good thing if they're all increasing their defense spending in response? Again, you can spend as much as you like on defense, but if everyone else spends the exact same amount of defense, then all you've done is both deprived yourself of actual productive spending. Again, the easiest defense against defending Ukraine or having wars in the Middle East is, Why don't we spend that money on ourselves over at home? But every single extra missile, every single extra tank you have to build is, literally anything else. It's an electricity plant you can't build. It's, it's a hospital you can't build. It's a piece of medicine you can't administer. Well, economies are all about decisions, and we are all increasingly making decisions that war is a best use of our defense spending. Now, that's great, because the more you spend on war preemptively, the more you can avoid a war, but it's also concerning when you say, like, wait, so we're all spending money on these pieces of, all of this infrastructure that is going to be worthless if we don't start a war. I sure hope that doesn't go poorly. But yeah, so interestingly, why is the United States doing this? I would like to just start with basically everything that you've seen coming out of the US recently, whether it's about the rage on Ukraine, whether it's about starting a deliberate, piece of, basically getting China to be in a very, very upset position, you could say. But the reason that the US is doing this is what you might call brinkmanship. This is the idea, this is from Wiktionary, the pursuit of an advantage by appearing to be willing to take a matter to the brink. For example, by risking a dangerous policy rather than to concede a point. Again, I think the simplest way you can describe what's happening in the world right now is that if you come to the negotiating table and you say, we are not willing to do anything that risks peace, and indeed the second point is, we are not willing to do anything that risks our country being unhappy with us because we're a democracy. Those are two very strong points. Those are two very strong, those are two very hard lines that prevent you from doing a lot of what you want to do. Whereas if you come to the table and you say, we're willing to start a war, we're willing to be unpopular, all we need to do is bring up one culture wars issue. We could start a war with you and people would be upset, but wait until they found out that, there were trans bathrooms involved somewhere else. They would forget about that war really quickly, or whatever the case may be, right? But I think that is the simplest way you can describe brinkmanship, is if you've got to be willing to say, we will do the unthinkable, so that when people compromise with you, they'll compromise closer to your position than to theirs, because they don't want to do the unthinkable. The North Korea model has been really successful for them, where basically every now and then they say, we will nuke South Korea, we will nuke you, we will go crazy, unless we just get a little bit of aid, because we're kind of starving right here, and then they spend the money on the food, so they can spend their own money on more nukes, so they get... It's been a very successful strategy for North Korea, but when it happens on a larger scale, with larger countries, I think that's when things get concerning. And so, is it a good thing that countries are spending more and more on defense? Because right now, here are the biggest military spenders. The United States, China, and Russia are all the way up there, with then India and Saudi Arabia being surprising fourths and fifths, and then it's the logical countries after that, UK, Germany, Ukraine. Interestingly, you can see Ukraine is spending about a third of their economy right now, a third of their GDP, on defense, because you kind of need to do that when your very existence is at stake. Whereas China has been, and indeed Germany is another great example, for a while they've been in a position where their defense hasn't really, even if there was going to be a runaway Russia coming towards Germany, Russia has to get through Ukraine or all of the Baltics and then get through Poland, and by the time they're at Poland, that's when Germany gets to be like, ooh, this is pretty concerning, eh? Maybe we should do something about this. Or you could argue they have to go through Finland, Sweden. It's basically impossible for Germany. Germany is surrounded by so many allied nations that they have felt for a while that we can spend decently, we can defend ourselves, but doing anything more than the bare minimum isn't really essential. The same is also true for China. China is trying to bring a peaceful regime around the world. I guess that sounds a little bit too forced there. But China is trying its best to focus on trade, and effectively by spending as little as possible on its military, China has been able to spend more on growing not just their not just their economy, but also their ties with other countries in more trade means. So China owns all sorts of port infrastructure around the world, while the US is building military bases in every country they can imagine. China is building brand new ports so that countries can better receive their goods, and you could argue that increasing military spending demands on everyone is a bad thing, because again, if everyone spends double as much on the military, everyone is at the same relative position. If China and the US both double their military spending, then the gap is still just as big in percent terms, And ultimately, all that you've achieved is less money can be spent on actual things people care about, roads, hospitals, whatever else. Or you could just say less money can be given to the people. Every piece of defense spending is money that an individual cannot spend themselves, by the way. The biggest, strongest point against military spending is that if we all just increase it, we all end up in the exact same place, but poorer. However, that is something you might want if your adversary in the world has gotten away with being in a peaceful region for too long. However, I also think it's kind of a ridiculous thing. I think one of the reasons that one of the interesting points that this article right here makes is that basically all military spending that comes from Europe right now, and from many parts of the world, does then rely on the US. And so if everyone increases their military spending, everyone is worse off, except maybe the United States, by being the largest military spender, and therefore in lots of places having the most expensive and best military tech. If the whole world wants to spend so much more on their military, maybe that's a win for the US. I don't think that that makes any sense whatsoever as a strategy. I don't think risking huge wars and huge catastrophes in many parts of the world is worth doing that for. But I think that the US, if they're thinking on an isolationist level, might just believe in very much that. And I do believe that it is worth spending, I think it's worth spending money on the idea of a military. But as soon as you move from money, because I think ultimately as a society, we have to decide that a few things have to be pulled in together. I think when we talk about when we talk about government spending, we're always talking about all sorts of cuts, right? Like, oh yeah, what sort of cuts should we make to government? What about this piece of infrastructure? Can we lower our welfare budget by 1%? And by that, we don't actually mean lower it by 1%. We mean, like, lower our increases by 1%. Oh, that's pretty, but the idea of welfare is, like, nice. It's probably useful for stability, but the actual absolute requirements for what should the government do collectively, because you can't fund your own private military, or you can't fund your own private roads or whatever, varies from person to person, but basically everyone agrees that defense of a country, probably policing, and also a legal system are things that a country needs to have, or it's pure anarchy, which might be your vision. But I think everyone agrees those things need to be on a level. However, do we need to have a military that is capable of projecting our desires onto the world? That becomes a bit more of an interesting question, and the US is certainly deciding, yes, we should be able to get what we want from the world. If we don't like what China's doing, we should be able to just say that, and the implicit threat is that we spend almost $1 trillion a year on our military, so get ready to fight otherwise. And is that a good thing? I really think it depends on how you think peace is defined. But yeah, that is why that I think the game of brinkmanship that the United States is playing is potentially dangerous, assuming that they don't actually have in the back of their mind that they will settle for peace, that they won't actually go to war over something. But will that happen? I don't know. Should you be scared? I would guess not. But, the risk has gone up some amount. Speaking of the risk, so I love covering elections on this channel, and you might be curious what elections are happening this year. And so here's a fun one. There's going to be a federal Australian election in just a short couple of months. And it's really weird because the last time they held an election in 2019, all of the candidates and the parties were different. I don't know what's happening there, huh? But also something interesting. I want to share this because I spoke about birth rates in a recent video. It was while I was gone in Canada, actually. It was minus 29 degrees, by the way. Like, literally, I was just in this forest over here somewhere, and it was minus 29. I had a Slurpee in my car, and I came out, and the Slurpee had frozen. I didn't know they could be more frozen than they came out of the tap. Anyway, so, interestingly, I spoke about birth rates while I was gone, and someone mentioned, like, well, actually, the reason people aren't having kids, you dum-dum, is because house pricing is too high. And very true. Even though home ownership and children don't actually correlate, the argument that you need to buy a home before you can have children is a pretty strong one, but I would then like to show you to my friend Las Vegas. So this is a city I lived in not that long ago. And let me tell you about where I used to live, because I made a video talking about exactly how much my rent was while I was there. In fact, I think I said it was $1,580. And when I went to renew that rent, they said I could spend between 1600 and 1800, depending on how long I was going to renew it for. However, something fun is I then went on that same apartment's website, and if I go to their availability, I think you can literally just find what it's weird like dynamic pricing, but for apartments. But if I want to go and look at an apartment, I can see that it costs what is that? 1,517. Actually, is there a cheaper one? 1,375 for there we go. It's weird website. 1,300. Okay, you're just gonna have to trust that it says right here that it's $1,375, and I can rent this as of April. So that means that in Las Vegas, the price not only is $1,300 for a one-bedroom apartment with all of the amenities you get here, this close to the city center, kind of nuts in my opinion. But it's gone down 200 and what is that? Like 200 and something dollars since I moved in, and over $200 since I moved out. So rents have gone down in Las Vegas. This is like across the board, house prices too. And what's interesting about that is if we then look at fertility rates, in a place where house prices are going down and home ownership is going up, is fertility high? Well, no, the highest fertility is in South Dakota. Maybe housing is cheap there. Then Nebraska and Alaska. Okay, that kind of makes some sense. And if we scroll all the way down, you can see Nevada is all the way down here. You could argue that gambling offsets some of the, do you want your children to be raised in Las Vegas is an interesting question. But as you can see, if birth rates are going down dramatically from 1.7 when I moved out to 1.56, now that apartment prices, now that all sorts of houses are that much cheaper, then that's proof that I don't think fertility and house prices correlate in the slightest. Because otherwise you would expect to see states where they are building more housing and housing is getting relatively cheaper to go up. But in all states, it is going down. The US is, in general, doing pretty well on birth rates, but still substantially below replacement rate, which is one of the reasons, it's something immigration, it's a whole thing. But I just wanted to bring that point up, because I also wanted to show you I've never seen anywhere else in the world. My whole life, rent is just, it's accepted that rent goes up, right? But Las Vegas is the only place where they actually build enough houses for the people. And so when demand for housing goes down, prices go down. Pricing for housing going down, I think it's nuts that can happen. But I also think it's really cool. Speaking of really cool, everything in this video, it wasn't that, was it? I haven't checked my camera. Oh, I don't have that little bit that's hanging out over there like I usually do. Oh, no, I do. It's the worst. If you're curious as to why that happens, it's because I have a green screen, but my green screen stops in like this specific corner, and my camera just tends to bounce, and there we go. Fixed it. Good to go now. Anyway, hope you all enjoyed. I am, in fact, back from Canada. I've got a very busy... is this standard for everyone? But, like, my March is very busy. Everyone's, like, just hibernated for the winter, and now it's like, okay, now I'm finally willing to do the first thing in 3 months. But yeah, I will be back with some more second channel videos soon. But not today. Wait, no, yeah, today. Here's the second channel video for today. But not tomorrow, probably. Maybe tomorrow. Anyway, thank you. Goodbye.